Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The holographic war map floated above the obsidian table, its ghostly glow reflecting off the polished stone like a specter whispering of conquest. The faces of the council, some scaled, some chitinous, others smooth and eerily humanoid, bore the same expression, a quiet certainty that victory was all but assured. Countless red markers, representing the combined might of the galactic hegemony, swarmed across the display like a vast tide, engulfing the sparse clusters of blue, the last remnants of the human fleet. Outnumbered, outgunned, and strategically cornered. A textbook end to yet another rebellious species. Grand Marshal Vorthan, his carapace gleaming under the dim lighting, regarded the display with an air of amusement. His kind, the Zalvoran, had seen countless campaigns. This was just another footnote in the long history of galactic dominance. He leaned forward, mandibles clicking softly in satisfaction. "The humans are tenacious," he admitted, voice a deep, resonant growl. "But tenacity does not alter physics. They are outnumbered 10,000 to 1. This war is already over. They simply refuse to accept it." A murmur of agreement spread through the chamber, the gathered officials exchanging knowing glances. The council was ancient, formed from the oldest and most powerful species in the known galaxy. They had witnessed resistance before. Young races often mistook ingenuity for strength, believing their fleeting moments of defiance could shift the course of history. It never did. Fleet Admiral Asura, her bioluminescent tendrils shifting through a spectrum of thoughtful hues, observed the tactical display in silence. Unlike the others, she did not exude the same unwavering confidence. Something was wrong. "I see no retreat formations," she finally said, her voice soft but pointed. "No fallback points. No attempts at dispersing forces to minimize losses." Her golden eyes narrowed. "If they understand the odds, why do they remain?" Vorthan exhaled sharply, the equivalent of a derisive scoff. "Because they are human. Stubborn. Reckless." He gestured dismissively, clawed fingers curling with impatience. They would rather perish in an act of meaningless defiance than accept their fate with dignity. Asura said nothing, but her doubt remained. The vote was cast. The decision made. Annihilation. The hegemony would commit its full force. Every available warship, from the swiftest interceptors to dreadnoughts the size of small moons, would converge upon the final human strongholds. The assault would be overwhelming, a display of firepower so absolute that no species would ever dare challenge the hegemony's rule again. The order was given. A vast armada surged forward, a crimson tide of destruction racing through the void, their weapons primed to erase the last embers of resistance. Thousands of ships, each a monument to the technological supremacy of the hegemony, locked onto their targets. And the humans simply waited. No evasive maneuvers. No desperate last-minute transmissions for surrender. Only a few hundred ships, motionless, positioned in eerie silence against the backdrop of the stars. Vorthan sneered. "They're paralyzed by fear." Then the void itself ignited. A searing white cascade erupted through the first wave of the fleet, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Entire squadrons were swallowed in an instant, their hulls folding inward as reality twisted and shattered around them. The weapons of the hegemony were designed to destroy ships, shields, flesh, but this was something else. There were no explosions, no debris, only absence. The ships simply ceased. Metal, energy, organic matter, every trace of them unraveled, reduced to nothing in the span of a heartbeat. The flagship of the assault fleet, a behemoth of war that had survived centuries of conflict, dissolved like a sandcastle against an unforgiving tide. Panic. The second wave hesitated, commanders barking frantic orders, but momentum carried them forward. Pride refused to allow retreat. This time, the humans moved. Not in desperation, not in reckless abandon, but with precise, calculated purpose. Their ships blurred, streaking across the battlefield in patterns that defied comprehension. The very fabric of space rippled around them, distorting reality in their wake. They weren't just fast. They weren't just advanced. They were breaking the laws of physics themselves. And then the second strike came. Singularities bloomed across the battlefield, swallowing entire warships without so much as an echo. Energy shields, once impenetrable, flickered and collapsed as armor plating twisted like melted wax. Thousands of years of technological supremacy, reduced to drifting ash in seconds. Vorthen stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the scope of the massacre unfolding before him. This was not war. This was execution. The bridge of his command ship, once filled with the steady hum of machinery and the confident voices of his officers, was now eerily silent. "This isn't possible," he whispered, hands gripping the console before him. Then, a transmission cut through every channel. No encryption. No demands. Just a voice. Calm. Deliberate. Human. "We did the math." The signal went dead, and the third wave fell before it could even fire a shot. The silence in the war chamber was suffocating. No one dared to speak. The holographic war map, once a testament to the hegemony's dominance, now displayed an unthinkable reality. Millions of red markers had vanished in an instant. Entire fleets, the pride of 1,000 worlds, gone without a trace. The remnants of the once mighty armada drifted through the void, shattered hulls and molten debris marking the graves of countless warriors. Grand Marshal Vorthen's hands curled into fists, his claws digging into his palms with a sharp, metallic screech. His species, the Zalvoran, prided themselves on their composure, but in this moment, control eluded him. His war instinct screamed that this was an impossibility, a failure of perception, a nightmare from which he would soon wake. Yet the evidence lay before him. The third wave was eliminated before it could even engage, a voice finally muttered. It belonged to High Strategist Korak, one of the few officers still able to form words. His normally unwavering tone now carried the frayed edges of disbelief. No survivors. No distress signals. Just nothing. The council chamber, a bastion of power for millennia, now felt disturbingly small. The weight of something greater than mere defeat pressed against its walls. This was not a battle lost. This was something far worse. An exposure of weakness. Fleet Admiral Osira's bioluminescent tendrils pulsed a slow, deliberate rhythm, betraying the rapid calculations flickering through her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was hushed but precise. "We must acknowledge the truth. Humanity has achieved a technological leap beyond our understanding. What we witnessed was not merely advanced weaponry. It was," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "a fundamental rejection of the rules we have built our empire upon." Vorthen snapped his gaze to her. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Osira countered. "Did you see debris fields? Did you detect radiation signatures? Explosions. Their weapons do not destroy. They erase." She turned her piercing gaze on the others. "And if we do not understand how, then we are no longer the dominant force in this war." A murmur spread through the chamber. The words were blasphemous, but none could deny their truth. Vorthen, refusing to yield, straightened his posture, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "They still bleed," he growled. "They still breathe. If they exist, they can be conquered." A new voice entered the conversation. Low, smooth, deliberate. "Can they?" All eyes turned to the dark corner of the chamber where the Chancellor sat, motionless. He had not spoken during the battle, not even as the tide turned against them. But now, in the aftermath, his presence filled the room with quiet authority. Vorthen's impatience was palpable. "You doubt our capacity for war, Chancellor?" "I doubt your capacity to recognize what has already happened," the Chancellor replied evenly. He gestured toward the war map, where only a handful of red markers remained. "We did not merely lose a battle. We failed to understand the enemy. We failed to anticipate them. And now, we do not hold the initiative. They do." Silence. It was Osira who finally asked the question hanging in the air. "Why did they let us live?" The humans had every opportunity to pursue, every strategic advantage to press forward. Yet, as soon as the last of the hegemony's warships were eradicated, their fleet did not advance. They remained, motionless, unhurried, as though the battle had never concerned them in the first place. Then came the transmission. "We did the math." It wasn't a declaration of victory. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. A cold, clinical assessment that sent a shiver through the most hardened of warlords. Vorthen, unwilling to be cowed, slammed a fist against the table, causing the holographic map to flicker. Enough of this cowardice. We are the hegemony. We do not submit to fear. We do not retreat like broken creatures. He turned to the Chancellor, his burning gaze unwavering. We must retaliate, regroup, find whatever advantage remains and strike. The Chancellor studied him for a long moment before finally rising. His movements were slow, deliberate, every gesture measured. And tell me, Grand Marshal, he said quietly, what advantage remains? Vorthen opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had none. There were no weapons left undiscovered. No tactical repositioning that could alter the outcome. Humanity had, in one stroke, rendered the mightiest force in the galaxy irrelevant. Technology, Asura murmured, thinking aloud. It is always the great equalizer. When a primitive race invents iron, stone becomes obsolete. When a species harnesses fusion, combustion becomes an artifact of history. We have ruled because we believed ourselves to be at the pinnacle of innovation. She turned to face the others. But we are not at the pinnacle. Humanity is. A realization swept through the council like a chilling wind. This was not simply a war. It was the end of an era. The Chancellor's expression was unreadable. He stepped away from the table, moving toward the vast window that overlooked the capital world of the hegemony. The city stretched before him, towering spires and brilliant lights, a civilization that had endured for millennia, now standing on the precipice of uncertainty. Tell me, he said after a moment, if our positions were reversed, would we have let them live? A long silence followed. No one needed to answer. The truth was obvious. If the hegemony had discovered a species with such overwhelming superiority, it would have obliterated them without hesitation. Humanity had not. That made them either arrogant beyond comprehension, or something far worse. A species that did not need to conquer. A species that chose to let its enemies stand. The Chancellor exhaled slowly. Then the question is no longer how we defeat them. He turned, his gaze colder than the void itself. The question is why they have not already destroyed us. The city stretched below the Chancellor like a living tapestry, its luminous veins of traffic pulsing through the towering structures that had stood for millennia. From this height, the street seemed tranquil, undisturbed by the war that had, in truth, already ended. But here, in the council chamber, there was no such illusion. Silence hung over the gathered leaders, suffocating and absolute. Not the silence of deliberation or strategy, but of something deeper, something raw. The absence of purpose. The war was over. The hegemony had lost. And humanity had not even bothered to claim its victory. Chancellor Malrith turned from the window, the glow of the war map reflecting faintly in his dark eyes. What remained of the once proud fleet was displayed in flickering red, an insult to what it had once been. A few scattered warships. No strategic formations. No reinforcements on the way. Only remnants, drifting like debris in a storm, awaiting orders that would never come. We must assume humanity's restraint is deliberate, he said at last, his voice measured, the first word spoken since the transmission had ended. They did not destroy us. That demands an answer. Grand Marshal Vorthen's mandibles twitched as he leaned forward, his heavy frame casting long shadows against the chamber walls. His breathing was steady, but tension radiated from him, barely contained beneath his hardened carapace. And what answer do you expect, Chancellor? That they are merciful? That a species capable of such annihilation suddenly finds itself too noble to use it? He exhaled sharply, a deep, guttural sound of frustration. We should be rallying what remains of our fleets, preparing to strike. With what? Fleet Admiral Asura's voice cut through the air, sharp and precise. She fixed Vorthen with a gaze devoid of patience. Shall we charge into oblivion, knowing the outcome will be the same? Shall we throw away what little remains of our people because your pride cannot bear the truth? Vorthen's claws curled into fists, but he had no answer. Malritha's fingers drummed against the edge of the obsidian table. Perhaps they are not as we were. Asura's tendrils pulsed in thoughtful rhythms. Explain. The Chancellor gestured toward the remnants of the war map. We assumed humanity would act as we would, that they would strike down their enemies the moment they gained the ability, that they would erase us, as we would erase them. His voice lowered, a quiet certainty settling into his words. But they did not. The chamber remained silent, the weight of his statement sinking in. Vorthen scoffed, though it lacked its usual conviction. You're suggesting they hold power and simply choose not to use it? That they do not need to rule, because they are beyond conquest? Malrith met his gaze. Yes. Vorthen let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. Impossible. Every empire that rises seeks to expand. It is in our nature. It is in all nature. Asura did not look away from the war map. Her voice was softer now, contemplative. Then perhaps they are something we have never encountered before. A ripple of unease passed through the council. War had always been inevitable. Empires clashed. The strong conquered the weak. That was the fundamental law of the galaxy. And yet, standing on the precipice of their own extinction, they were forced to consider a terrifying possibility. That law no longer applied. The chamber doors hissed open. A junior officer stepped forward, his bioluminescent skin dimmed with unease. "Chancellor," he said carefully, "we have received another transmission." The words sent a chill through the room. "Put it through," Malrith ordered. The chamber darkened. The holographic display flickered to life. Unlike the previous message, this one was not a simple, cryptic statement. This time, there was a face. The human on the screen appeared unremarkable, dark-haired, middle-aged, his features plain, almost forgettable. But his eyes were anything but. There was no hatred in them, no arrogance, not even satisfaction, only indifference. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of malice. "You misunderstand," he said. "We are not merciful. We are not cruel. We do not believe in conquest, nor do we fear it. We did not let you live out of kindness." A pause. "We let you live because you are irrelevant." The word struck harder than any weapon ever could. The council had ruled through dominance, built an empire upon the principle that power dictated existence. But now, in the face of a species that had everything, that held the strength to erase them with a thought, they were nothing. The man continued, his tone unchanged. "Your war is over. Your fleets are gone. There is nothing left for you to fight for. You can spend the next century rebuilding, if that is your wish. It will not matter. By the time you recover, we will be beyond even your ability to comprehend." A flicker of something in his expression. Not amusement, not pity, just quiet finality. "We do not rule because we have no need to. We do not conquer because there is nothing left in this galaxy worth conquering. You may cling to the idea of power, but power is irrelevant when one understands the true nature of the universe." Another pause. "Go home." The screen cut to black. No one spoke. Malrith exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the cold surface of the table. The words were not a threat, not a warning, a statement of fact. Vorthen's voice was barely a whisper. "They do not see us as rivals." His throat tightened, his pride warring with the truth. "They see us as insects." Asura's expression did not change, but her tendrils dimmed. "No," she murmured. "Not even insects." She looked at the war map one final time. "They do not see us at all." Malrith turned back to the window. The city still gleamed below, its people moving about their lives, unaware of what had just transpired, of what it truly meant. The hegemony had not just lost a war, had lost its place in the universe. And now, in the vast silence left behind, the council faced a question more terrifying than defeat. What does a fallen empire do when its conquerors no longer acknowledge its existence? The air in the council chamber was heavy, thick with something deeper than fear, uncertainty. It clung to the room like dust settling over ruins, coating everything in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of the transmission still pressed against them, suffocating, inescapable. Outside, the capital city pulsed with life, oblivious. The streets below gleamed with the soft glow of transit lanes, the towering structures casting long, spindly shadows across the skyline. This world had stood for centuries, the beating heart of an empire that had ruled the galaxy without question. But the illusion of permanence had shattered. Chancellor Malrith sat rigid, his fingers intertwined before him, unmoving. His gaze was locked on the empty screen where the human's image had been. He had expected war. He had prepared for annihilation, for the last embers of the hegemony to be stamped out in fire and fury. But he had not prepared for this. You misunderstand. We let you live because you are irrelevant. The words echoed in his mind, stripped of emotion, devoid of malice. Humanity had not spared them out of kindness. They had not granted mercy. They had dismissed them. A rustling of movement broke the silence. Grand Marshal Vorthen rose to his feet, his claws raking against the stone table as he steadied himself. His mandibles quivered, the ridges along his plated skull flaring in agitation. The fury that had burned so fiercely before was gone. In its place was something quieter, something unfamiliar. We cannot, his voice faltered. He exhaled sharply, gathering himself before trying again. We cannot allow this. Fleet Admiral Osira lifted her gaze, her bioluminescent tendrils flickering in subdued waves of contemplation. And what do you propose? Her voice was level, but there was something unreadable in her tone. A challenge, or perhaps a warning. Vorthen's mandibles clicked together. We do what we have always done. We rebuild, we strengthen, we prepare. For what? Osira asked, tilting her head slightly. Another war? Against what exactly? She gestured to the war map, its remaining red markers flickering like dying embers. Tell me, Grand Marshal, how does one fight a war against an enemy who has already moved beyond you? Vorthen bristled. We adapt. We survive, Malrith corrected, his voice quiet but firm. The Grand Marshal turned to face him, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the Chancellor's seat. You speak of survival as if it is enough, he growled. It is not. It has never been. Malrith met his gaze without flinching. And yet, it is all we have. A heavy silence settled between them. Vorthen exhaled, stepping back. We have spent centuries ruling, he said, his voice lower now, almost contemplative. We have been the strongest force in the galaxy. Feared. Respected. His claws flexed at his sides. And now? Now we are nothing. An afterthought. Malritha's fingers drummed once against the table. Then we must decide what we will become. Vorthen's mandibles twitched. And what do you suggest, Chancellor? That we accept this? That we allow our empire to wither and die because some arrogant species deems us unworthy of their attention? Osira's tendrils flickered again, slow and deliberate. Perhaps we should consider why they do not see us as a threat. Vorthen turned sharply. Because they are arrogant. No, Osira said, shaking her head. Because they are beyond the things we measure power by. Or resources. Territory. None of it matters to them anymore. She glanced at Malrith. They see something we do not. The Chancellor leaned back slightly. And that, he murmured, is what should concern us the most. Another silence, but this one was different. Heavier. More dangerous. Vorthen let out a low exhale. His body was still tense, his movements sharp, but the fire behind his eyes had dimmed. He was a creature of war. A leader forged in conflict. He had always known who he was, what he was meant to do. But now, the battlefield had been taken from him, and he did not know what remained. We need answers, Malrith said finally, breaking the silence. If humanity has surpassed us, we must understand how. Vorthen scoffed. You think they will tell us? They already have, Osira murmured. Both Vorthen and Malrith turned toward her. She gestured toward the dead transmission. They told us exactly what we needed to know. They are not interested in conquest. They do not seek dominion over us. And yet, they have chosen to speak with us. Why? Vorthen frowned. To mock us. No, Osira shook her head. To warn us. Malritha's expression darkened. You believe there is something worse? Osira hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. I believe there is something we do not yet understand. And if we fail to understand it, we will not survive what comes next. The weight of her words settled over them like a storm on the horizon. The hegemony had spent centuries shaping the galaxy in its image, believing itself to be the pinnacle of power. But now, they stood at the edge of something greater than war, greater than politics, greater than themselves. Humanity had changed the rules. And if the hegemony did not learn why, then survival would not be an option. Not for them. Not for anyone. The war map flickered, its red markers dimmed to near extinction. The chamber, once a sanctum of strategy and dominance, had become a mausoleum for an empire that no longer held dominion over anything but its own broken pride. The leaders of the hegemony sat in uneasy silence, though not the thoughtful kind that precedes action. This was the silence of something unraveling. Chancellor Malrith stood at the head of the obsidian table, his gaze lingering on the holographic wreckage of their once mighty fleet. He was not a man prone to doubt, yet doubt now whispered in the recesses of his mind. "We need to send an envoy," he said finally. Vorthan's mandibles flared, his claws tightening against the table. "You mean surrender?" Malrith turned to face him. "I mean survival." The Grand Marshal rose sharply, his plated armor catching the dim light as he paced toward the chamber's edge. "You would have us kneel before them," he growled, his voice bristling with restrained fury. "After all we have built, all we have conquered, you would have us." "I would have us understand," Malrith interrupted. His tone was calm, but steel lay beneath it. "Or do you prefer ignorance?" Vorthan's mandibles clicked, his breath slow and deliberate. "They do not see us as a threat. That much is clear. But do not mistake their dismissal for tolerance." His gaze locked onto Malritha's. "What if they see an envoy as nothing more than an inconvenience?" Asura, who had been watching in contemplative silence, finally spoke. "Then we will finally know where we stand." Vorthan exhaled sharply, his frustration barely concealed. "And what if where we stand is in the way?" Malrith tapped a single finger against the table. "Then we will learn that before it is too late to move." The chamber remained tense. Outside, the capital city carried on in blissful ignorance, its people unaware that the foundation beneath them had already begun to crack. "They gave us a choice," Malrith continued, his voice measured. "We can return to the ruins of our empire, pretend that we are still what we once were. Or we can find out why they did this." Vorthan let out a bitter laugh. "They did it because they could." Asura tilted her head, her bioluminescent tendrils pulsing in slow contemplation. "No, they didn't destroy us because they didn't need to." Vorthan scoffed. "A distinction without a difference." Malritha's eyes narrowed. "No, it is the only distinction that matters." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Asura turned to Malrith. "Who do we send?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "You." Vorthan's reaction was immediate. "Absolutely not." His massive form leaned forward, casting a shadow across the table. "You would send one of our highest-ranking officers into unknown territory to negotiate with a species that may not even acknowledge her existence?" "Yes." Asura studied Malrith for a long moment. "I'll go." Vorthan exhaled, shaking his head. "Madness." "No," Malrith said. "It's the only chance we have." The diplomatic vessel departed in silence, slipping through the void like a ghost. Unlike the warships that had once darkened the skies of conquered worlds, it was sleek, unarmed, its very presence a statement of humility. Asura sat in the forward chamber, watching the endless abyss beyond the viewport. The stars stretched out before them, cold and indifferent. Somewhere in that vast unknown, humanity was waiting. The transmission had been sent. Short, direct, carefully worded. "The hegemony seeks an audience." There had been no response. Not yet. The crew moved in hushed efficiency, their fear unspoken but palpable. Asura could see it in the way they avoided each other's eyes, in the stiffness of their postures. No one knew if they would return. A soft chime broke the quiet. "Admiral," the communications officer said, his voice carefully controlled. "We have an incoming signal." Asura inhaled slowly. On screen, the viewport flickered, and then they were there. Not a person, not a face, a single line of text. "You were not meant to arrive this soon." Asura's pulse slowed, but she did not look away. "Transmit response," she said. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Ready." She spoke without breaking her gaze from the screen. "Then tell us why." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ship lurched. The stars outside stretched, as though space itself had been pulled taut. Every console flickered, the artificial gravity fluctuating in a sickening wave. The laws of motion, of physics, seemed to stutter, as though something had reached into reality and twisted it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Asura stumbled but caught herself, fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. The screen remained dark, save for one change. A set of coordinates. No explanation. No demand. Just a destination. The bridge remained still, the only sound the quiet hum of the ship systems recalibrating. Asura exhaled. Set course. The helmsman hesitated. Admiral, we don't know. We do not have the luxury of knowing, she said. We only have the choice to follow. Vorthan had called this mission madness. Maybe he was right, but they had come for answers. And now, at last, humanity had decided to give them one. The ship drifted through the void, guided only by the coordinates humanity had given them. No stars. No celestial bodies. Just an expanse of darkness deeper than space itself. Sensors returned nothing, as if they had moved beyond the reach of known physics. Asura sat in the command chair, her fingers lightly curled around the armrests, her tendrils pulsing in slow, deliberate patterns. The crew around her remained tense, working in near silence, their eyes flicking between readouts that told them nothing. Admiral, the helmsman murmured, his voice strained. We should be there. Asura nodded. Drop sublight speed. The ship slowed. The nothingness outside remained unchanged. Anything on sensors? She asked. The officer at the terminal hesitated before responding. Nothing. No gravitational distortions, no structures, no. Anything. A hum of unease moved through the bridge. Even in the void of space, there was always something. Particles, radiation, remnants of long-dead stars. But here, there was absence. Then the transmission arrived. Not as words. Not as an image. But as understanding. Asura blinked. Her mind filled with knowledge that was not her own. Not thoughts, not language, but a concept. An invitation. And suddenly, the void was not void at all. A station materialized before them. It had not arrived. It had not been hidden. It had simply not been perceived until now. The structure was vast, an impossible lattice of shimmering silver and shifting geometry. It did not rotate, did not reflect light, yet it existed in perfect clarity, more real than anything Asura had ever seen. The bridge crew reacted with a mix of awe and unease. No alarms had triggered, no sensors had detected movement, yet the station now dominated the viewport. This wasn't here before, one of the officers whispered. It was, Asura murmured. We just weren't allowed to see it. A docking corridor extended toward them, its edges seamless, as if space itself had decided to reshape for their arrival. Asura stood. Prepare for disembarkation. The crew hesitated. Admiral, the helmsman began. We don't even know if we can breathe in there. If they wanted us dead, we wouldn't have made it this far, she said simply. She turned and walked toward the airlock. The moment Asura stepped onto the station, she understood. The floor beneath her was neither metal nor stone but something undefined, firm yet shifting, like walking on thought made solid. The corridor stretched outward, not leading to a room or a chamber but to an experience. She was alone. Her escort had not followed. Or rather, she knew with certainty that they had never been meant to. A presence surrounded her. Not oppressive, not hostile, but aware. Watching. Measuring. You seek answers, a voice said. It was not sound. It resonated inside her mind, bypassing language, embedding meaning directly into thought. Asura steadied herself. Yes. You are not the first. A shape coalesced before her, humanoid, but not human. A silhouette of shifting energy, something neither solid nor ephemeral. Its form was an approximation, a translation for her mind to process. We destroyed nothing, the entity said. You were always destined to collapse under your own weight. We simply removed the illusion of permanence. Asura's breath was steady, but her tendrils dimmed slightly in response. Then why speak to us at all? The entity was silent. Then, because you are still here. Asura frowned. Explain. For all your wars, your conquests, your need to dominate, you have arrived at the threshold of something greater. Many before you crumbled before reaching this point. You have not. A pause. You ask what we are. That is not the question you should be asking. Asura's pulse slowed. Then what is? The entity leaned closer, though it had no face, no expression, no breath. What will you become? The words reverberated inside her, deeper than mere speech. A challenge. A choice. Asura held its gaze, if it could be called that. We adapt, she said. We evolve. The presence around her pulsed, something like approval but more vast, more distant. Then step forward. The station shifted. No, not the station. Her perception of it. The corridor she had entered was gone, replaced by something immeasurable, something not meant for unprepared minds. Beyond the threshold was knowledge, an understanding beyond empires, beyond war, beyond everything the hegemony had built itself upon. And she took the step. When Asura awoke, she was on the bridge of her ship. The station was gone. The coordinates erased. Her crew stood around her, watching, waiting. Admiral! She exhaled, pressing a hand against her forehead as the weight of what had transpired settled into place. Set course for home, she said. Vorthan had wanted war. Malrith had wanted survival. Neither had understood. The hegemony would never rule the galaxy again. But now, they had something far more important. A future.